population. So, how do we use this? What does this mean? Well, the first off is that we need to understand that we had no difference in pregnancy rate between our breeding box and our squeeze chute. But once we have that, we still have to ask the question, why? So what? So the first thing that we need to understand is that before that animal ever enters the chute, we have stressed it out. When we gather those animals, we bring them in from the pasture, we sort them, we separate them from their calves, we're disrupting them with their natural behavior. We are generating a stress response by simply being around them. We also need to understand that we're generating an acute response, and that pregnancy is not as affected by more of a chronic or stress response as opposed to acute. When we look at the literature is going to view reproductive efficiency after a controlled overload of stress hormones. So if you go and you look into the literature, you're going to look at animals that were given exogenous stress hormones, so exogenous adrenocorticotropic hormone or exogenous cortisol, and those are going to more closely mimic a chronic stress response as opposed to a true acute response. And then our natural occurrence of stress hormones is dependent on behavioral temperament and acclimation handling. So you saw earlier that we had a large number of rather calm animals. Those animals had been worked through those facilities multiple times. They're acclimated, so every time we run them through that facility, they have a less and less noticeable stress response, and that's been shown in the literature. So again, on the terms of acclimation, when we look at acclimation to human handling, it's been shown that acclimation to human handling in facilities could have an impact on acute stress response in females exposed to fixed time to AI. So again, if they have been worked through this facility before, they're used to it. This is not a novel experience for them. Therefore, that acute stress response is not going to be as high. We've already stated, and we're going to continue to discuss that in the literature, that acute stress response doesn't necessarily have that big of an impact on reproduction, but in instances where it does, it's typically in a novel setting. So every time that these cattle are acclimated to a set of facilities, we are reducing that acute stress response. So, and again, I already stated that all of these cattle had been exposed to this prior to the experiment. So cortisol is classified as a glucocorticoid. Okay, it is a stress hormone, and in the literature, glucocorticoids are viewed as a negative in terms of reproductive efficiency. But physiologically, these glucocorticoids are preserving the process of ovulation. The way they're able to do this is they're going to downregulate the synthesis and production of prostaglandin and help, although it could delay ovulation, it is still going to allow it to happen. So in terms of temperament cattle will exhibit higher stress responses sooner and longer than calm cattle. So in terms of temperament, these females that are more excitable, they're going to have larger flight zones. So whereas a female that is acclimated to facilities, that is acclimated to human handling, their stress response isn't going to occur until maybe we separate them from their contemporaries or we put them in a holding facility. Excitable females that aren't acclimated, they're going to have a stress response upon sight of human because that is unnatural to them. Okay, so we're going to generate that stress response immediately upon human contact. So cortisol could increase following an ACTH spike post-breeding, possibly preventing ovulation. So it's been looked at and shown that after we stress these animals that our cortisol could rise. And it could be argued that we could take a second measurement of cortisol after they leave the chute. But if we do that, we're again going to generate a second acute response by running them through that squeeze chute or through that breeding box and by handling them further. And again, these temperamental cattle, they become stressed quicker and they stay stressed longer. Okay, so they're going to become chronic a lot longer, and we could generate a more chronic type response if we continue handling them. So in our results, we found that no predictability of cortisol. We had no predictability of cortisol. Part of this is going to be due, again, to our lack of diversity in temperaments among our cattle. So studies have shown that if we have excitable cattle, they will have increased cortisol. Because we had so few excitable cattle, we could not find that difference. So So we could not reconfirm the results from Cook and others in 2012, partially because we utilized primarily Boss Taurus cattle, whereas in this study they utilized Malore or Bos Indicus cattle. We utilized a different cortisol kit for our assays. That's why if you compare my study with the literature, you'll see a numerical difference in cortisol levels. We attribute that to our assay kits. And then again, we had a lack of diversity in temperament. So it has been stated, and again in different papers and in different proceedings, that we don't need these excitable cattle. These excitable cattle are less productive, so we need to be selecting from calmer cattle that are going to have those increased pregnancy rates and have those decreased cortisol responses. And again, that can be found in different studies, and this is going to justify our cattle population for the study. So someone could argue that, well, you need more excitable cattle. This is very real world. These are real production cattle. This is the information that we want to give the producers that they can utilize. So again, our current data is suggesting that if you do not have a breeding box, there's not necessarily a need to go out and buy one today. You're going to obtain similar pregnancy rates in a squeeze chute as you would in a breeding box. And if we go out and purchase a breeding box, we're going to increase our overhead on that operation for no increase in production. As we saw with the RA Brown, if we have a permanent box, we're going to have to increase the amount of infrastructure, which again is added cost. And then one of the things that we looked at and noticed is that in the use of a breeding box and fixed time AI protocols, we cannot give injections that meet BQA standards. There is no head gate. There is no way to catch the head of that animal and then give an injection properly in the neck. If we give a GnRH injection to that female, we're having to give it into a primal cut that is going to be used for beef consumption. However, if you do have a breeding box, you can argue that we're going to get those similar pregnancy rates. So an example is for me as a larger person, as an AI tech, I sometimes get crowded in a squeeze chute. Okay, that AI box or that breeding box allows more room for technicians. It's safer for technicians, and there is it hasn't been analyzed, but we can possibly decrease the amount of struggling by an animal during breeding. So in terms of future research, we believe that we need to determine the effects of acclimation to a breeding box and a squeeze chute and see if it has an effect on the pregnancy rate. So all of our cattle were, for the most part, acclimated to both facilities. If we introduce a novel aspect to this study, how does that affect our results? The second thing we wanted to look at is what is the threshold between acute stress versus chronic stress? We found, and we talked about today, and the literature shows that chronic stress is going to be more detrimental to reproduction than acute stress is. But one of the things that we can't really find is that where is that threshold? Is there a threshold for 5 temperament cattle versus 1? And how do we meet that? So, and can the breeding box have an impact on more temperamental cattle? So we analyzed again primarily very, very calm cattle. We didn't run very many, very many excitable ones. Therefore, we could not come to the conclusion on whether it had an effect on excitable cattle or not. And then, can we replicate these results when utilizing Bos Indicus cattle? So again, everything that we used was Bos Taurus. If we have Bos Indicus cattle, are we going to see those same results? So our conclusions, our take home for today. Both the breeding box and the squeeze chute are viable restraint methods for AI. So as producers, if we have one that we're more comfortable with, we can obtain the results that we're looking for through the use of either facilities. Stress responses are more dependent on temperament than restraint mechanism. Again, if we have excitable cattle, it has been shown that they will be less likely to get bred than calm cattle. Excitable cattle also provide a different array of challenges to production that we didn't talk about in this study. And then our last take home is that we can minimize chronic stress. We can truly combat lack of reproductive efficiency. So if we have that acute stress, it's been shown that that's okay, that handling these animals is going to generate an acute stress response. It's minimizing the amount of chronic animals, or the amount of animals that are chronically stressed, that is going to help us exceed those AI conception rates that we have now. So a few people that I'd like to thank. I'd like to thank Tarleton State University and the Department of Animal Science and the Tarleton Student Research Grant for funding this project. I'd also like to thank people at Virginia Tech University for providing the cattle in their labs. And I'd like to thank R.A. Brown Ranch for allowing us to come on their property and be around during their breeding season and utilize their cattle facilities for this project. I'd also like to thank a few people personally. My parents couldn't be here today, but I'd like to thank my parents, Bill and Debbie Carroll, for pushing me to do this. As Dr. Roper said, I had a very different path here, so I'd like to thank them for pushing me. I'd like to thank my brother Colin for being here today and for helping me with this project. He was the only one that every time I called and said, hey, I need help, and he was in the truck. And so thank you, Colin, for being there. I'd also like to thank Dylan Whiteacre, Drew Gonzalez, and Layla Benzer for their help with the project. They were there as both friends and colleagues and were willing to help the project. I'd like to thank my graduate committee, Dr. David Roper, Dr. Brandon Smith, and Dr. Leanna Kinney, for their mentorship through this process. I could have never gotten up here and presented this data and this information to you today without their guidance. I'd like to thank Dr. Vitor Mercadante and his graduate student Nicholas Diaz for allowing us to utilize their facilities for our cortisol assays and for opening up their lab at Virginia Tech. And I'd like to thank my fellow graduate students and everyone that's here today. My students, if I've had you in class, thank you. You've made everything up to this point such a wonderful experience, and I've been able to grow so much. So thank you for your time up to this point. And thank you for being here today. I now stand ready for questions. Thank you.